Jake Miller stood outside the massive hangar door with the key feeling heavy in his hand, while the morning sun cast long shadows across the empty spaceport where nobody came anymore, except security guards who barely did their rounds. His uncle, Frank, had died exactly 1 week ago in his sleep, and the lawyers said he left Jake everything, which was strange because Jake had only met the old man 3 times in his entire 25 years of life. The will reading yesterday had shocked everyone, especially when the lawyer mentioned a spaceship stored in Hangar 17 at the old section of the spaceport that had been closed to public traffic for over a decade. Jake pushed open the rusty door, which screamed on its hinges like it was protesting the disturbance after years of silence, and stepped into darkness that smelled of metal and oil and something else he could not identify. When he found the light switch and flipped it on, Jake gasped, because the ship before him was enormous, taking up almost the entire hangar with its bulk, though it looked like it had seen much better days. The hull was covered in rust and strange markings that might have been decorative once, but now looked like scars, while loose panels hung open, showing tangles of wires and components that seemed too advanced for such an old vessel. Jake walked slowly around the ship, which was shaped like nothing he had seen before, with a long central body and wings that swept back in curves that seemed both beautiful and functional despite the decay. What caught his attention most was a large dome in the center of the ship, made from some kind of crystal that glowed softly with inner light. And unlike everything else, this dome looked perfect, without any damage. Reached out to touch the crystal but stopped when he heard footsteps behind him, and spun around to see a tall figure emerging from the shadows, between some old equipment crates. The figure stepped into the light, revealing itself to be a robot standing, about 7 feet tall, with a chrome body that should have been shiny, but was dulled by age, though its movements were smooth and precise. "Hello, new owner," the robot said in a voice that sounded almost human, except for a slight mechanical undertone. "And I am Unit 7, designated guardian of this vessel and its contents." Jake took several steps backward because he had not expected to find anyone or anything else in the hangar, and his heart was racing from the surprise of the robot's sudden appearance. "I have waited here for 300 years. The robot continued, while its amber-colored eyes seemed to glow brighter in the dim hangar light. "And you are the first to arrive with the proper genetic markers." "That makes no sense," Jake said, finding his voice, though it came out shaky. "Because my Uncle Frank only bought this ship 20 years ago at a government auction, and I have all the paperwork." Unit 7 tilted its head in what seemed like amusement and said, "Your uncle was merely the latest in a long line of caretakers who have protected this vessel while waiting for the true heir to arrive." Jake felt anger replacing his fear, because this sounded like some kind of elaborate joke, though he could not imagine his uncle setting something like this up, since the man had been serious to the point of being boring. "Listen, robot," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "I inherited this ship legally, and that means I own everything in it, including you. So start making sense, or I will have you scrapped." 7 did not react to the threat and instead gestured toward the crystal dome, saying, "The answers you seek are sealed within, but the conditions for opening the seal have not been met, so we must wait." "What conditions?" Jake demanded, and walked toward the dome again. But 7 moved faster than any robot should be able to, blocking his path with arms spread wide to prevent access. "The war must begin," 7 said, and its voice carried weight like it was speaking about something inevitable rather than possible. "And only then will you understand why this vessel exists." Jake wanted to argue more, but something about the robot's certainty made him pause, and instead, he decided to explore the rest of the ship to see what else his uncle had left him. The interior was a mix of familiar and alien, with controls that looked human-designed, sitting next to panels covered in symbols that hurt to look at for too long, like they were trying to tell him something. 7 followed, Jake through the ship, answering basic questions about systems and maintenance, but refusing to elaborate on anything regarding the dome or the war. It kept mentioning, which grew more frustrating, in what seemed to be the captain quarters Jake found. Personal belongings that must have been his uncle's, including photos of places Jake did not recognize, and notebooks filled with sketches of star patterns. One photo showed Uncle Frank standing next to 7 in front of the ship, but the photo looked old and yellowed, though Frank appeared no younger than Jake remembered him from their last meeting. How long did my uncle own this ship? Jake asked Seven while studying the photo and trying to make sense of the impossible timeline because nothing about this inheritance was adding up. 17 years, 4 months, and 6 days. Seven replied with mechanical precision before adding, he was a good caretaker who understood the importance of maintaining readiness for what must come. Jake spent hours going through the ship and discovered that despite its appearance, many systems still functioned, though he could not understand how half of them worked, even with his engineering background. The engines used principles that violated everything Jake had learned in school, while the navigation system showed star charts for regions of space that Earth telescopes had never mapped. As night fell, Jake decided to sleep on the ship, partly because he wanted to understand it better, and partly because something about it called to him like it was where he belonged. He lay in the surprisingly comfortable bed in the captain quarters and stared at the ceiling, while his mind raced with questions about what he had inherited and why Seven kept talking about war. His dreams that night were vivid and strange, showing him vast battles between ships that defied physics, while beings of light fought creatures of shadow among stars that burned wrong colors. In the center of every dream was a woman with pointed ears and silver hair who reached out to him, speaking words he could not understand, but that made his soul ache with longing. Jake woke suddenly to find Seven standing in the doorway, its amber eyes glowing in the darkness, and the robot said, softly, "You dream of her because your bloodline remembers even if your mind does not. Who is she?" Jake asked, sitting up and rubbing his eyes while trying to hold on to the fading dream images that seemed important somehow. Though he could not say why, she is the reason this ship exists, Seven answered and moved to look out the small viewport at the stars visible through the hangar roof. And she is the answer to the war that approaches. Outside the hangar, the world continued its normal routine with people living their lives unaware that in this forgotten corner of the spaceport things were stirring that would change everything. Jake did not know it yet, but his inheritance was more than just an old ship and a mysterious robot, because he had inherited a responsibility that would determine whether humanity survived what was coming. The next morning, Jake would begin trying to repair the ship, and Seven would teach him things that no human should know, while the crystal dome waited patient, as it had for centuries. Soon the conditions would be met and the seal would break, releasing what lay within to face the war that even now raced toward Earth from the depths of space. But for now, Jake slept again and dreamed of silver-haired women and dragons made of starlight, while Seven stood guard as it had for 300 years, waiting for destiny to arrive. 3 months had passed since Jake inherited the mysterious spaceship, and during that time his life had changed completely as he moved into the hangar and dedicated himself to understanding the vessel. Every morning, Seven would wake him at dawn to begin another day of repairs and training, while teaching him systems that seemed to operate on principles beyond current human science. The robot proved to be an excellent teacher with infinite patience, as Jake struggled to grasp concepts that violated everything he thought he knew about physics and engineering. Jake discovered that the ship responded to his touch in ways that felt almost alive, with panels lighting up when he approached and controls adjusting themselves to fit his hands perfectly. Some days he would spend hours just sitting in the pilot seat running simulations that Seven had programmed, which showed combat scenarios against enemies that existed only in the training programs. The enemies in the simulations were always the same insect-like ships that moved with mechanical precision and used weapons that turned matter into energy and energy into nothingness. Seven never explained who these enemies were supposed to represent, but Jake noticed the robot watched these simulations with unusual intensity, as if remembering real battles. During the repairs, Jake found technology that should not exist, including engines that folded space instead of pushing through it, and shields that existed partially in other dimensions. Also discovered weapon systems hidden throughout the ship, with cannons that fired beams of coherent gravity and missiles that could phase through matter until they reached their targets. Seven helped him understand enough to make basic repairs, but Jake sensed the robot was holding back knowledge, as if waiting for something, before revealing the ship's true capabilities. The crystal dome remained sealed, despite Jake's many attempts to find a way inside, and Seven continued to insist that the conditions were not yet met, though it would not explain what those conditions were. Jake had given up his apartment and his job to focus on the ship which his friends thought was crazy. But something deep inside told him this was more important than anything else. He spent his evenings studying the notebooks Uncle Frank had left behind, which were filled with observations about the ship and cryptic notes about preparing for something called the convergence. One notebook mentioned dreams of silver-haired women and dragons, which made Jake shiver because his own dreams had become more vivid with each passing night. In his dreams, he flew through space without a ship, while beside him soared creatures of impossible beauty with scales that reflected the birth and death of stars. The woman from his dreams appeared more frequently, and sometimes he could almost understand her words, which spoke of ancient wars and duties that transcended death itself. Jake began to notice changes in himself as well, with reflexes that were faster than before, and an intuition about the ship systems that went beyond what Seven had taught him. He could sense when something was wrong with the ship before diagnostic systems detected it, and his hands would move to controls without conscious thought. 3 months and 2 days after Jake had inherited the ship, he woke not to Seven's usual greeting, but to the robot standing at the window staring at the sky. Something was different about Seven's posture, with a tension in its mechanical frame that Jake had never seen before, while its amber eyes tracked something in the morning sky. "They have arrived," Seven said without turning, and Jake felt ice run through his veins because the robot's voice carried a weight of certainty and dread. Jake joined Seven at the window and looked up to see what appeared to be new stars in the daylight sky. But as he watched, he realized these were not stars, but objects moving against the blue. The objects grew larger as they descended, and Jake could make out shapes that matched exactly the enemies from his training simulations, with angular hulls that seemed to absorb light. More ships appeared every moment until the sky was filled with them, and Jake understood that this was not a visit but an invasion force beyond anything Earth could resist. Cities around the world erupted in chaos as the alien ships opened fire with beams of red energy that turned skyscrapers into molten glass and vaporized anything organic. Jake watched the news feeds in horror as Earth military forces scrambled to respond, but their missiles and bullets passed harmlessly through shields that existed in multiple dimensions. "We must leave immediately," Seven said, and grabbed Jake's arm with surprising gentleness for a machine. "And if we remain here, we will die and everything will be lost." Part of Jake wanted to stay and fight to help defend his world, but Seven's urgency made him listen, and he ran to the bridge to begin the launch sequence. His hands moved across controls with practiced ease from 3 months of training, while Seven sealed hatches and brought weapons online with mechanical efficiency. The Star Whisper lifted off just as alien fighters detected their hangar and opened fire. But Jake flew through the attack pattern using skills he had only practiced in simulation. The ship responded to his will more than his hands, and they burst through the hangar roof as it exploded behind them, accelerating toward space while death rained down on Earth. Once they reached orbit, Jake could see the true scale of the invasion, with thousands of ships surrounding Earth like predators circling wounded prey. The main alien vessels were massive beyond comprehension, with some the size of small moons, while swarms of fighters moved between them in perfect formation. Jake felt despair crushing him, because how could one old ship make any difference against such numbers when all of Earth's military might was being swatted aside? "The conditions are now met," Seven announced, and moved to stand before the crystal dome while opening a panel in its chest that Jake had never noticed before. From within the hidden compartment, Seven withdrew a key that seemed to be made from captured starlight, with patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid light. The robot inserted the key into a hidden slot at the base of the dome, and immediately the crystal began to dissolve from top to bottom like ice, sublimating in reverse inside the dome. Jake could see a figure floating in golden energy that pulsed with its own rhythm, while something else moved in the shadows behind the figure. As the crystal fully vanished, the golden energy faded, and the figure inside began to move with gestures too graceful and fluid to be human. She had skin that seemed to hold its own light, and her ears came to delicate points, while her hair was the color of moonlight and moved as if underwater. Wrapped around her was a creature from mythology, with scales of midnight blue scattered with points of light like stars and wings folded against its serpentine body. The woman's eyes opened, revealing irises of deep violet that held depths of knowledge and sorrow, while she looked at Jake with recognition despite never meeting. How long have I slept, she asked, and her voice had musical undertones that made each word resonate in Jake's bones, while the creature on her shoulder stirred. 300 years, Lady Aria 7 responded, with something like reverence in its mechanical voice as you commanded. When you sensed the enemy would eventually find this world, Aria stepped from where the stasis field had been and moved with steps that seemed more like dancing, while the dragon creature opened one eye to study Jake. She walked to the viewport and observed Earth under siege, and her expression hardened into something dangerous, while her hands began to glow with blue light. So the Zarathi have finally come, she said, and turned to face Jake, who was still trying to process what he was seeing. Because none of this matched reality. You are the heir. 7 told me about. She continued and approached Jake with movements that made the air itself seem to part for her passage. Jake could only nod because his voice had abandoned him in the face of this impossible woman, who looked like she had stepped from his dreams into reality. I am not from Earth, Aria explained as she moved to the ship's controls and began activating systems Jake did not even know existed. My people were called the Stellar Guard, and we fought the Zarathi across 10,000 star systems before they found ways to defeat our defenses. She showed him displays of battles beyond imagination, where ships of living crystal fought alongside dragons against mechanical hordes that consumed everything in their path. But before our final defeat, Aria continued while her hands danced across controls that reconfigured themselves at her touch. Our seers saw possible futures. In every timeline where the Zarathi won, they encountered one species that could stop them. If that species was allowed to develop without interference, that species, she said while looking directly at Jake with those impossible violet eyes, was humanity, and that is why I have waited 300 years for this moment. Aria moved through the Star Whisper like she had designed it herself, and systems that Jake had never been able to activate came alive at her touch, filling the bridge with holographic displays. The dragon on her shoulder stretched its wings and yawned, showing teeth like black glass before jumping down to the floor where it began to grow with each step. Jake pressed his back against the wall as the creature expanded from house cat size to something that filled half the bridge with its presence. And power, this is Cosmos, Aria said while running her hand along the dragon's neck. And he is the last of the void dragons who once flew between stars without need of ships. The dragon looked at Jake with eyes that contained swirling galaxies, and Jake felt like he was falling into infinite space before Cosmos blinked and lay down. You fear him, Aria observed, and there was no judgment in her voice as she continued. But Cosmos means you no harm, as you are the inheritor. 7 protected, Jake forced himself to step away from the wall, though every instinct screamed danger when looking at a creature that should not exist according to all known laws. I do not understand any of this, Jake said, and his voice sounded small in the presence of these ancient beings who radiated power beyond comprehension. Aria gestured for him to join her at the controls, and when Jake reluctantly moved closer, she touched his forehead with one glowing finger. Images flooded his mind, showing the history of a war that had raged when humanity was still learning to use fire and make tools. He saw fleets of crystalline ships that sang as they flew through space, crewed by beings like Aria, whose very presence brought order to chaos. The Stellar Guard had held the line against the Zarathi expansion for 10,000 years, using technology and abilities that merged science with something beyond. Dragons flew alongside the ships, breathing energies that unmade Zarathi weapons, while elf warriors danced through battles with grace that turned violence into art. But the Zarathi adapted as they always did, taking the best of each species they conquered and adding it to their collective strength. They learned to counter Stellar Guard magic with technology that disrupted the fundamental forces the elves commanded and created, weapons specifically to kill dragons world after world fell, as the Zarathi consumed entire civilizations and added their knowledge to the collective, creating an enemy that grew stronger with each victory. Yet even as defeat became certain, the Stellar Guard seers looked into possible futures, seeking any hope that the Zarathi could eventually be stopped. In timeline after timeline, they saw the Zarathi consuming the galaxy until nothing remained but their mechanical perfection and the silence of extinction. But then they found anomalies in the timeline centered on an unremarkable planet orbiting an average star in a spiral arm far from the galactic core. On this world, a young species was just beginning to understand tool use and fire. But the seers saw something in them that existed nowhere else. Where other species developed along predictable paths, humans showed unlimited potential for growth, able to master any discipline and combine them in new ways, in futures where humanity reached the stars without interference. They became something the Zarathi could not defeat or absorb, because they never stopped growing. The visions ended, and Jake found himself back on the bridge, gasping for breath while tears ran down his face from what he had witnessed. Every species has limits, Arya explained as she turned back to the controls except yours, which is why the Zarathi fear what you could become. She showed him more displays, and Jake saw that the ship was transforming around them, with walls shifting to reveal weapons he could not have imagined. Your DNA carries locks placed there by evolution to prevent your brains from burning out if development happens too quickly, but I can remove those locks. Jake felt fear at the idea of changing at such a fundamental level, but also curiosity about what humanity could become if freed from limitations. Outside the viewport, Earth continued to burn as Zarathi forces systematically destroyed military installations and population centers with mechanical efficiency. We need to help them, Jake said, and was surprised by the determination in his own voice, despite the overwhelming odds they faced. Yes, Arya agreed, but first you must understand what you are fighting and why humanity matters in a conflict that started before your world formed. She explained that the Zarathi were not evil in the traditional sense, but rather represented a philosophy of perfect order through assimilation. Believed the galaxy would be better when all consciousness was united in their collective, with no war or conflict, because there would be only one mind. But such unity means the end of growth, Arya said while guiding the ship away from immediate danger as diversity dies and with it all possibility for change. Cosmos raised his great head and spoke directly into Jake's mind with a voice like distant thunder saying, "The universe requires chaos and order in balance." Jake staggered from the mental contact but found he could understand the dragon, though the communication was unlike anything he had experienced. Seven moved to steady him, and Jake realized the robot had been more than a guardian, but a teacher preparing him for this moment. Your uncle knew this day would come, Seven said, because the bloodline carries memory even when the mind forgets, and he prepared you as best he could. Jake thought of the 3 months of training and how quickly he had learned systems that should have taken years to understand. The ship shuddered as Zarathi fighters found them and opened fire. But the shields held, though. Jake could feel them straining against the assault. Arya danced her hands across controls, and the Star Whisper moved in ways that defied physics, sliding between dimensions to avoid the worst attacks. "We cannot run forever," Jake said as he took his position at the weapons console, finding he knew exactly what to do without thinking. "Nor do we intend to," Arya replied with a smile, sharp as winter wind, because it is time humanity learned what they truly are. She opened communication channels that reached every human receiver on Earth, from military installations to personal devices, and began to speak. Her voice carried power that transcended language, and every human who heard it understood regardless of what tongue they spoke. "I am Arya of the Stellar Guard," she said, "and I bring truth about your species and why these invaders fear what you will become." She told them about the genetic locks and how they could be removed, and across the planet, humans began to feel something stirring within them. Some military commanders ordered their forces to ignore the transmission, but soldiers who heard it felt changes beginning. As dormant potential awakened, Jake watched tactical displays as human resistance began to shift from desperate defense to something more coordinated and effective. "They are beginning to understand," Arya said with satisfaction as the first humans started breaking through their limitations on their own. The Zarathi noticed the change immediately and redirected forces toward the Star Whisper, recognizing it as the source of this new threat. "Let them come," Cosmos rumbled, and the dragon moved to a specially designed chamber where he could access the ship's weapons directly. Jake felt power flowing through the ship as Arya removed the safety limitations and revealed the true capabilities of the vessel. "This is what the Stellar Guard created. In their final days," Arya explained as weapons came online that could crack moons if necessary. But the greatest weapon, she continued while looking at Jake, is not technology, but the potential within humanity waiting to be unleashed. The Zarathi fleet moved to surround them, and Jake knew they were outnumbered thousands to one, but he no longer felt despair. Instead, he felt determination, because humanity deserved the chance to grow beyond limits, and he would help give them that chance. Arya placed her hand over his on the controls, and Jake felt knowledge flowing into him about tactics and strategies refined over millennia. Together we will show them why they were right to fear humanity, she said as the first wave of Zarathi fighters entered weapons range. The Star Whisper descended through the burning atmosphere, while Jake watched the controls transform under Arya's touch into something far more advanced than before. Every surface of the ship seemed alive now, with panels flowing like liquid metal to reveal weapons and systems that had been hidden for 3 centuries. Jake could feel the ship responding to his thoughts as much as his hands, and realized the interface was adapting to work with his awakening human potential. "You are learning faster than expected," Arya said, while deflecting Zarathi fire with shields that bent space around them, making the enemy beams slide away. Seven stood at a secondary station coordinating defensive systems with mechanical precision while providing Jake with constant updates on their situation. Cosmos had merged partially with the ship itself, and Jake could sense the dragon consciousness flowing through every system, adding his ancient power. Below them Earth burned, but Jake could also see pockets of resistance growing stronger as humans began to change in response to Arya's message. "We need to reach as many people as possible," Jake said while plotting a course toward the largest concentration of survivors in what remained of New York area. Nodded and began preparing for something she called the Great Unlocking, which would free humanity from the genetic chains that limited their growth. She explained that human DNA was unique in containing dormant sequences that appeared in no other species, like a cosmic lottery ticket waiting to be claimed. These sequences were not placed there by design, but by the random chance of evolution, creating a species with truly unlimited potential for development. The Zarathi discovered this during their reconnaissance, Arya said while her hands glowed brighter, "and that is why they came now, before you could discover it naturally." Jake thought about human history, and how many times people had pushed beyond what was thought possible, from exploring new continents to reaching the moon. "But those were small steps compared to what we could become," he said with growing understanding. "And the Zarathi want to stop us before we take the large ones." "Exactly," Arya confirmed as they descended toward the ruins of Central Park, where survivors had gathered in a defensive position against Zarathi ground forces. The ship landed with surprising gentleness for its size, and immediately soldiers surrounded them with weapons raised. Not knowing if this was friend or foe, Arya stepped out first, and her presence had an immediate effect, with soldiers lowering their weapons as they stared at the impossible elf woman. Beside her, Cosmos emerged at his full size, and several soldiers fell to their knees in shock at seeing a living dragon larger than a building. "I am here to give you what was always yours," Arya announced, and her voice carried to every human in the area, touching something deep in their genetic memory. She moved among the survivors and began the process of unlocking their potential with each touch, removing the barriers that evolution had placed for safety. A young soldier named Lisa was first, and when Arya touched her forehead, the woman gasped and fell to her knees as her mind expanded. Jake watched in amazement as Lisa stood up with eyes that now saw spectrums beyond visible light and reached for a Zarathi weapon dropped in battle. Without any training, she understood the alien technology completely and began modifying it with rapid movements that seemed impossible moments before. Others came forward, and Arya unlocked them one by one, while Jake found he could help by guiding them through the initial shock of transformation. An engineer named Marcus suddenly understood principles of physics that humanity had not yet discovered, and began sketching designs in the dirt. A medic discovered she could see illness at the cellular level and heal injuries by adjusting biological processes with focused thought alone. Each person manifested different abilities based on their natural talents and inclinations, creating a diversity that was humanity's greatest strength. The Zarathi forces noticed the change and redirected their attacks toward the park, but found their enemies were no longer the same species they had been defeating. Soldiers predicted attack patterns before they happened, and scientists created energy shields from scavenged equipment using principles they suddenly understood. This is what they feared, Arya said as she watched awakened humans working together in ways that multiplied their individual abilities exponentially. Jake understood now that humanity was not just another species but something unique in the galaxy with potential that had no upper limit, but with great power comes great challenge, Arya warned, as some people struggled with the weight of expanded consciousness and unlimited possibility. Seven moved among those who were overwhelmed and spoke in soothing tones about focus and control, helping them adjust to their new state. The robot had been programmed for this, Jake realized, and everything from the past 3 months had been preparation for helping humanity through this transition. We need to reach more people, Jake said after seeing how 50 awakened humans had turned the battle in the park into a rout of Zerathi forces. Arya agreed and called Cosmos, who lowered his massive head so they could climb onto his back, with Seven activating its own flight systems. From the air they could see the transformation spreading as awakened humans shared their knowledge with others, creating an exponential expansion. In Tokyo, a soldier touched an alien weapon and suddenly understood not just how it worked, but how to improve it beyond Zerathi design. In London, a scientist looked at equations that had puzzled her for years and saw the solutions as clearly as reading a children's book. In Cairo, a child picked up a piece of alien technology and reshaped it with her mind into something that generated food from raw energy. The diversity of human potential expressed itself in millions of ways, with no two people developing exactly the same abilities or understanding. This is why they cannot assimilate you, Arya explained, as they flew between cities, spreading the awakening wherever they went. The Zerathi collective mind requires uniformity, but humanity thrives on differences that combine in ways that create new possibilities. Jake felt his own abilities growing stronger with each passing hour and found he could sense the network of awakened minds forming across the planet. Through this network, humans shared knowledge and experience, instantly creating a collective intelligence that maintained individual identity. Unlike the Zerathi hive mind, each human remained themselves while being able to draw on the knowledge and support of others when needed. The Zerathi fleet in orbit began charging weapons that Jake could sense were designed to crack the planet rather than just destroy surface life. They would rather destroy Earth than let humanity reach its potential, Arya said with disgust, clear in her voice. Jake felt rage at the thought, but also determination, because they had come too far to fail now, when humanity was just beginning to understand itself. We take the fight to them, he declared, and both Arya and Cosmos made sounds of approval, as if they had been waiting for him to reach this decision. Seven calculated trajectories and weak points in the Zerathi fleet, while awakened humans on the ground began building weapons from salvage technology. The transformation of humanity was accelerating beyond even Arya's expectations as people pushed past limits that other species would have accepted. A group of teenagers in Mumbai discovered they could merge consciousness temporarily to solve problems beyond any individual capability. An elderly man in Berlin found his body regenerating as he learned to consciously control cellular processes that had been automatic everywhere. Jake looked, he saw humanity rising to meet the challenge with creativity and determination that justified the Zerathi fear. But time was running out as the planet-killer weapons reached full charge and humanity would need to act as one to survive the next hour. Arya looked at Jake with those ancient violet eyes and said, "Now you understand why I waited 3 centuries, because this moment changes everything." The moment of truth arrived as Jake stood on the bridge watching Zerathi dreadnoughts position themselves to fire weapons that would split Earth into fragments around the world. Awakened humans linked minds in a network that grew stronger with each new person who joined the collective consciousness. Unlike the Zerathi hive mind, where individual identity was lost, the human network preserved each person while allowing them to share strength and knowledge. Arya had explained this was humanity. Unique gift because they could unite without losing what made each person special and different. "We have one chance," she said, while her hands configured the Star Whisper into its final battle form with weapons that drew power from dimensions beyond. Normal space Cosmos roared from the hangar bay where he had grown to his maximum size, feeding on cosmic energies that Arya channeled through the ship systems. The dragon mind touched every awakened human on Earth, and Jake felt the connection like electricity running through his bones and soul. Together, Cosmos spoke directly into the network, and his voice was thunder and starlight, combined as one force against those who would end our growth. Jake opened his mind fully to the human network and felt millions of consciousness touch his own, in a sensation beyond any description. Scientists who had awakened shared their understanding instantly, with soldiers who combined it with tactical knowledge to create new strategies. Children contributed, imagination without limits, while adults provided experience and wisdom, creating a synthesis that transcended age or background. Artists saw patterns in the Zarathi formations that logic alone would miss, while engineers built solutions that art alone could not create. The diversity of human thought created something the Zarathi had never faced before, because it was chaos and order dancing together. 7 coordinated with artificial intelligences around the world that had also evolved when their human operators awakened, creating hybrid consciousness. The planet itself seemed to pulse with new life, as awakened humans found they could tap into Earth's magnetic field and use it for power. Jake felt the moment approaching when everything would depend on perfect synchronization of billions of minds acting with single purpose. Through the network, he reached out to every awakened human, saying, "Together we are more than the sum of our parts, and today we prove it." The Zarathi fired their planet killers, and beams of impossible energy lanced down toward Earth, carrying death for an entire world. But at that moment, every awakened human acted as one, and reality itself seemed to pause as billions focused their will on survival. The energy beam stopped in midair, held by nothing more than human determination, made manifest through unlocked potential working in harmony. Now Arya commanded, and Cosmos launched himself from the ship, breathing void energy that wrapped around the frozen beams like living darkness. The dragon power combined with human will began reversing the energy flow and turning the planet killer beams back toward their source. Zarathi commanders tried to shut down their weapons, but the feedback loop had already begun and their own power was being turned against them. Jake watched through the viewport as the first dreadnought imploded when its own planet killer energy returned, amplified by human creativity. One by one, the massive Zarathi ships began to fail and fall as awakened humans found ways to disrupt their systems from Earth. A group of hackers who had awakened discovered they could interface directly with Zarathi computers and began corrupting their collective consciousness. Musicians found frequencies that interfered with Zarathi coordination, while mathematicians calculated probability cascades that made their tactics fail. The transformation was not without cost, as some humans burned out from channeling too much power, but others stepped forward to take their place. Jake felt tears on his face as he sensed brave souls giving everything to protect Earth. But their sacrifice only strengthened human determination. The Zarathi had expected to face a primitive species, barely into space travel, but instead found something beyond their comprehension. Where they had unity through assimilation, humans had unity through diversity, and that made all the difference in the battle. Arya guided the Star Whisper through the collapsing Zarathi formation, while its weapons sang with power drawn from human will itself. Every shot found its mark, guided by the precognitive abilities of awakened humans who could see seconds into possible futures. The last Zarathi command ship tried to flee, but Cosmos caught it in claws that could grip across dimensions and began to squeeze. "Wait," Jake said through the network, and to his surprise, the dragon paused as all eyes turned to him for explanation. "We are not them." Jake continued, feeling the weight of speaking for humanity in this moment, so we offer them a choice they never gave others. Through the network, he reached out to the Zarathi collective consciousness that was reeling from its first defeat in millennia. "You came to destroy us because you feared what we might become," Jake said. "But we choose to be better than our fears." He offered them something the Zarathi had never conceived of, which was alliance without assimilation and growth without consumption. The silence stretched across space as the collective mind struggled with a concept outside its experience of consume or be consumed. Some awakened humans protested through the network, wanting vengeance for the billions who had died in the invasion. But Jake felt Arius, approval, and Cosmos, agreement as he held firm to the offer of another way forward for both species. Finally, the Zarathi responded with confusion and wonder, because they had never encountered mercy from a species with power to destroy them. We accept consideration of your proposal, came the mechanical response, and learn from this defeat what we failed to understand before. The remaining Zarathi ships powered down their weapons and waited while humanity decided what to do with enemies who might become something. Elsaria smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since awakening, and said, "You have passed the real test, which was not power, but wisdom." The weeks that followed saw changes beyond anything history had recorded, as humanity rebuilt, not just their cities but their entire civilization. Awakened humans created technologies that merged science with abilities that would have been called magic in earlier times. Cities rose from the ashes, with architecture that existed partially in other dimensions, while being beautiful beyond previous imagination. The Zarathi kept their word and began the slow process of learning to exist without consuming others, which proved difficult, but not impossible. Some humans chose to help them, showing the same mercy Jake had demonstrated, because growth meant helping others grow. 27 became an ambassador between species, using its unique perspective to translate concepts between organic and mechanical consciousness. Area established schools where humans could safely explore their potential without burning out from trying too much too fast. Cosmos chose to remain on Earth, saying he had found in humanity the spark dragons had sought throughout the universe. Within a year, Earth had changed beyond recognition, as awakened humans built ships that could travel between stars as easily as walking. Other species began arriving, drawn by news of the Zarathi defeat, and found not conquerors but teachers willing to share knowledge. Jake stood on the observation deck of the new space station, watching Earth spin below while ships departed for distant stars. Beside him, Arya watched with satisfaction as humanity took its first steps into a larger universe, no longer limited by fear. "We did it," Jake said, still amazed at how much had changed since he inherited a rusty spaceship from his uncle. "No," Arya corrected gently as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Humanity did it by choosing growth over fear and unity over division." In the distance, Cosmos flew between the ships like a constellation come to life, and his joy was visible in every movement. The age of limits had ended, not with conquest but with understanding, and the galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had awakened to its true potential and chosen to use it not for domination but for lifting others to grow beside them. The stars no longer seemed distant but welcoming as humans ventured forth to explore and learn and become everything they could be.